It's been a few years since this happened, but to this day I feel almost sick thinking about that night. When I was in my very early 20s, I lived in some pretty shitty, cheap apartments that were known for being a little sketchy. I had a neighbor that always seemed to be listening to James Brown and Motown, so even though he seemed a bit off, I thought, how could he be that weird if he's chilling to some old school music? I'd hear him blast his music and have loud conversations. One night he was drinking a lot and had his girlfriend around. You could hear him being belligerent, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for him, I suppose. It wasn't too late, so I headed out for the night with some friends while my boyfriend at the time stayed in. I got dropped off around 1 a.m. or so, and as we were driving into the parking lot, from afar we saw my neighbor outside in between cars and the apartment looking sort of odd. At that point my friends were more weirded out than I was. I didn't think much of it and had them drop me off near the entrance. They drove away and I walked up to go into my apartment. To get there I had to pass his first. I swear my heart dropped because he was standing still with his body hidden by the bush that is between our apartments, like the funny Homer Simpson meme, but actually not funny whatsoever, because as I approached, it seemed like he thought maybe I didn't see him because it was so dark and he was as still as statue. I waved and mumbled hi because I freaking see you and I'm not going to pretend that I don't. At that point, after acknowledging he was there, he stepped out from the side of the bush and came into the dim porch light. Never in my life have I looked into eyes like that. They were widened, dark, and fully dilated, just like a wild animal, almost lunatic if I were to express his energy as well. He didn't say anything but gave me a bone-chilling look. I ran into my apartment immediately. My boyfriend was drowsy since it was late, but he did say the neighbor's music had been loud and had continued for some time. He had heard a lot of noise and arguing earlier in the evening, but didn't think anything of it. That night, all night we heard thumps, and it also sounded like furniture was being moved. I was seriously weirded out knowing he was awake in the state I viewed him in. He had seemed almost primal. The next morning I heard the cops outside banging on his door, and was partially relieved to see them, but then super scared of why they were there in the first place. They took him away in handcuffs shortly after demanding to be let in. They then questioned me, asking when was the last time I had talked or seen him. I told them what had happened the previous night, the arguing, the noises, the frightening encounter, and the thumping all night. What I found out the next day will make my stomach turn forever. I was told by the groundskeeper, details I will keep simple since it was horrendous, that Motown James Brown listening neighbor brutally murdered his girlfriend that night, dismembered parts of her and dragged the rest of her body near the train tracks which was directly behind our apartments. It hit me that the cold, primal, and wide-eyed look I had seen in that man was that of a person who had just taken another human being's life in such a vicious and disgusting way. I felt so sad for this woman who did not deserve to go like that. She was always quiet, sweet, and seemed a bit down on her luck. To this day, my stomach turns thinking about how close I was to death, quite literally, and how he could have ambushed me out of insanity since he was just waiting in the darkness when I walked up. To all of you who follow their intuition and gut feeling, listen to it. If you have a bad feeling about someone, even if they seem harmless, stay a safe distance the hell away from them. I moved into a different apartment right after. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. That neighbor went to jail, and I saw his booking photo. It was so damn scary to see him again, and I just hope he's staying in jail where he belongs. I lived next door to Old Man Werther for the first 7 years of my life, but I only ever saw him twice. No one in the neighborhood knew much about him or ever saw him leave his house, which stood dark and silent all year round. His back garden was always a mess, with dying flowers and brown scratchy shrubs growing out of control. But the grass and the bushes never became quite so badly overgrown that you knew it was entirely neglected. My dad used to joke that Mr. Werther must tend to his garden in the dead of night. My best friend Ned lived in the house on the other side of Old Man Werther. Ned was mad about football, and all we ever seemed to do after school was boot the ball around one of our backyards. And of course, every 5 minutes the ball would be over the fence onto our reclusive neighbor's property. We'd learnt that knocking on his door was no use, so whoever kicked it had to clamber over the fence and retrieve it themselves. I dreaded going and rooting through the tall bushes for the ball. Sometimes I thought I saw the curtains twitch in the gloom. Ned was always bolder than I was, and he'd tease me as he knew I was afraid. Hanging over the fence watching, he'd shout that Old Man Werther was looking out of an upstairs window, then a downstairs window, then he was opening his back door. I wasn't quite gullible enough to believe him, but still I couldn't breathe until I had chucked the ball back and flung myself to safety. Ned wasn't a bad kid, he was just cocky. When it was his turn to fetch the football, he'd pee in a bush, stomp on as many decaying flowers as he could, and creep right up to those black windows to peek inside. He'd tell me he saw the curtains snap shut, but I always thought he was just winding me up. A thin kitchen window was always open a crack, and he'd suggest we try to open it further and climb inside to see if the old man had secretly croaked years ago, as was widely assumed. One afternoon after school, I was aimlessly kicking the ball about, alone, as Ned hadn't called round even though he'd said he would. Inevitably, the ball soon went over. In horror, I watched it bounce against a knackered old oak tree and sail straight down to Old Man Werther's house, much closer than I'd ever been before. My heart still, it took an eternity to creep along through the long yellowed grass, before finally lifting the ball and feeling like Indiana Jones when he held aloft that little golden statue. Emboldened, I was compelled to have a quick look through the nearest window. Nothing. Just a pure black hole with tattered brown curtains on either side. I was about to turn and stride away when I saw movement. A face appeared. It was my friend Ned. He was only there for a second. His face was bright red. He looked me in the eyes through floods of tears. I couldn't hear him through the dirty glass, but it looked like he was screaming his little lungs out. Then an arm, so thin and pale that it looked like a bone, hooked Ned beneath his chin, and he vanished. The curtains were thrust shut. 3 seconds later, I was hammering at my back door to be let in. My mom thought I was messing about at first. Then she suggested that I had imagined things. She knew I was scared of our strange neighbor. But she soon began to take me seriously and phoned Ned's mother, who was awfully surprised as Ned hadn't returned from school. She'd assumed he had gone straight round to my house. The police were called. Several officers visited Old Man Werther while a nice young officer spoke to me for what seemed about 4 hours. But no trace of Ned was ever found, despite 2 further searches over the next few days. The same young officer returned a week later and told me that Mr. Werther wasn't a suspect, and that maybe my mind had been playing tricks. She pointed out that Mr. Werther was in his late 80s and had never been in any kind of trouble before, but she seemed troubled and unsure of her own words. Something came to light during the investigation that surprised the whole neighborhood. Old Man Werther earned his living as a rather brilliant children's illustrator. The police had found literally thousands of small sketches all over his walls. He'd worked with the same prolific author for years, churning out 4 or 5 children's novels a year. I wasn't a big reader, but I knew I'd spotted one of their books in our school library, so I didn't waste any time the next day. I couldn't wait to have a look. I soon wished I hadn't. It was a cheesy novel featuring a group of kids around my age who solved a burglary or something. There were 15 or 16 illustrations breaking up the text. One picture was of 3 boys playing football in a suburban backyard, and they half resemble me, Ned, and another lad we knew. Even the clothes were similar. Hands trembling, I flicked through the book. There I was again, along with more kids who all seemed to closely resemble ones who lived near me. One picture showed Ned creeping through an overgrown garden to peer through a dark window. I shoved the book in my mom's face and blabbered about the spooky similarities. She assured me that any resemblance was a coincidence, that it was all in my little mind. I I spent those last weeks in the old house terrified by the thought of Old Man Werther peering from his upstairs windows, from where he had a clear view of 9 or 10 local backyards, and maybe 20 local children. I didn't like to play football there anymore. I saw Old Man Werther a few days before we moved away. I'd become a very troubled young man, and my fitful sleep was filled with torments. Waking in a familiar panic at around midnight, I sat up in bed and peered out of the window over the backyard. Under the bright full moon, I saw a figure next door. He was just skin and bone but very tall, bald on top with long tangled silver hair down to his slender shoulders. He had terrible overbite, and several jagged teeth pointed down his lower jaw. His nose was crooked as if once broken. His white chest was bare. He wore only heavy ancient green overalls. I couldn't see his eyes behind gigantic goggles, like a World War II pilot might have worn, or a welder. Moonlight glinted in each lens as big as a beer mat. In his hands was a rusted watering can. I can't be sure, but I had the feeling he was looking at me. The last time I ever went back there, I saw the young family who had moved into our old house. Their 5 kids, aged about 3 to 10, were screaming with delight as they kicked a football around. My family and I used to live in a rough neighborhood when I was a kid. One night it was just my mom, my 2 siblings, and I at home. My dad had gone on a business trip. At around midnight, someone started knocking on our door. My mom woke up, went to the front door, and asked who it was. No one answered. She thought that maybe it was some kids playing ding-dong ditch, so she went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, again, someone started knocking. Once again, she got up and peered through the side window to see if she could spot anyone out there, but nobody was there. She started to worry, so she went back to the room, grabbed my dad's double barrel, and sat in the living room in the dark, waiting. Then after a while, she heard more knocking. My mom began shouting at whoever it was that she was going to call the cops, and that if anyone tried to come in, she would shoot them. At about 2:00 a.m., the police finally showed up and did a quick search outside of our house while we waited inside. After their search, they told my mom that they had found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long next to the front door, and asked if it belonged to my mom. She said that it wasn't hers and asked why. The cop told her that if it wasn't hers, it belonged to whoever was knocking on the door, that they were likely planning on strangling her with the barbed wire when she opened the door to see who was knocking. They said that she was very smart to not open the door to see who was there, otherwise it could have cost her her life. The cops said that they would patrol the neighborhood until morning and would then do a thorough investigation once there was daylight. That morning, as they were searching around the house, they found footprints leading around to the back of the house and up to my bedroom window. They had also found nicks in the windowsill where the person was trying to pry it open to break in but failed. Other footprints led to our neighbor. My mom, for some reason, had suspected it was this neighbor because she would often catch him staring at her through his curtains, and he wasn't very friendly. He had also accused my mom of poisoning his cat, which never happened, and he knew when my dad wasn't home, since he knew what vehicle he drove. Unfortunately, there was no evidence to prove it was him, but the police did question him. In the following days, we noticed him staring at us with an evil glare, and we even found a note on our front door. The note read, "Bye-bye." Whatever that meant, we don't know, but my mom saw it as a threat. Although we didn't see who actually put the note on the door, my mom just knew without a doubt that it was him. We moved out of that house after that.